Tell me about the traditional architecture of your country.
The traditional architecture of Korea can be seen in traditional houses. Traditional houses in Korea are made of wood and soil. The walls are thick and the roofs are curved. In addition, traditional houses have only one story. Also, they are usually surrounded by a yard or a garden.
Okay, before we look at this first answer, let's just look at the criteria for Band 7 for fluency and coherence. It says here, uses a range of connectives and discourse markers with some flexibility. Now, connectives doesn't just mean the words that you use, it also means that internally the sentence and your answer as a whole should be well connected. So let's have a look at this answer here. Okay, so here is our answer. The traditional architecture of Korea can be seen in traditional houses. Traditional houses in Korea are made of wood and soil. The walls are thick and the roofs are curved. In addition, traditional houses have only one story. Also, they are usually surrounded by a yard or garden. Now look at how often traditional is repeated. So we should try to get rid of that and try to use some pronouns or other features to connect our ideas. So first sentence I think is fine, but we can get rid of this traditional houses. Why don't we just replace that with they? So they are made of wood and soil. And now if you look at this sentence here, it's pretty short. Traditional houses in Korea are made of wood and soil. So why not combine these two? They're made of wood and soil with thick walls and curved roofs. And then here, in addition, traditional houses. So let's get rid of this traditional. In addition, these houses have only one story. And then we can get rid of this also, because then we can use a longer sentence, usually surrounded by a garden or a yard.
Do you live in a traditional house or a modern one?
At present, I live in a modern house. When I was young, I lived in a traditional house with my family. But when my father started to work in Seoul, we moved to a new and modern house, which is where I have lived with my family since. The details that make our home modern are the furniture, the materials used, and the exceptional landscaping.
Okay, here for the second answer, this person is talking about two different times in their life. So in the beginning, they lived in, I don't know, like an old traditional house, and then later they moved. So we have some contrast going on here, right, between the time that they lived in this old house and the time when they lived in the modern house. So when he starts off by saying, at present I live in a modern house, well, that's fine. This part here about when I was young, it seems kind of out of place, because if you're going to say you live in a modern house, why not say why? But the why is here at the end. The details that make our home modern are blah 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 blah. So why not put this right after your statement, because this is the support of your statement, right? So instead of that, why not say, at present I live in a modern house? This details part is kind of weird. Instead of that, why not say, what makes it so modern are the furniture, materials used, and the exceptional landscaping. Then this nicely supports your statement here. Now I added a so here just so you can emphasize that a little bit. And when you're talking about furniture or the materials or the landscaping, why not give an example? So talk about some of the furniture or the material used or the landscaping. You don't need to give examples of all of these. That's going to make your answer very long. But at least talk about one of these. And then here, we need a word to signal that we are now talking about something different. This is the situation right now. This is the situation in the past. So you could say, well, you know, that's very different from when I was young. Or this is very different from when I was young. And then you can talk about what happened when your father moved to Seoul and all of that. Well, we needed something here to show that it's now a different situation.
What kind of house do you prefer to live in? A traditional one or a modern one?
I prefer to live in a modern house because modern houses are much more comfortable to live in. These houses often have modern equipment that makes people's lives more convenient. Thus, I find it better to live in a modern house.
Okay, and this question here, what kind of house do you prefer to live in, a traditional one or a modern one? Just look at how many times the word modern is repeated. Well, surely that's unnecessary. So let's look at what we can do. This first part, I prefer to live in a modern house. That's fine. Because now here we can replace this with they, right? Just use a simple pronoun. They're much more comfortable to live in. These houses, this modern equipment, we can replace that with mod cons, which is short for modern conveniences. These houses often have all the mod cons that make people's lives more convenient. And then how about giving an example of how? So what kind of mod con, what kind of equipment can make people's lives more convenient? Is it like a washer, dryer, air conditioning, or whatever? And then here at the end, this summary is not necessary. I mean, if you look at the original answer, the whole thing is just 2 sentences long. You don't need to summarize an answer that's 2 sentences long, so you can just leave this out. That is repetitive.
Do many people in your country still live in traditional houses?
No, they don't anymore. Only very few still reside in traditional houses. Most of the people in Korea live in modern houses now, because the government had to take down most traditional structures due to safety issues.
Okay, so the next question here, do many people in your country still live in traditional houses? I don't have too much to say about this. I mean, the person does have some strengths when it comes to vocabulary, like, for example, here, instead of live, he says resides. He says traditional structures, which is good, and also safety issues, and also take down. It's not bad. Just one suggestion here where he says most of the people in Korea. Why don't you just say most people in Korea? Because you're not talking about a specific group of people. You're just talking about people in Korea in general. So we don't need the of the.
Are there any famous traditional buildings that you admire?
Yes, there are. I admire the traditional houses in Hanok village in Jeonju. There are more than 800 traditional Korean houses there. When I see them, I remember my ancestors who used to live in such houses.
Okay, here's the next question. Are there any famous traditional buildings that you admire? He talks about these traditional houses, but he doesn't really give a reason why he admires them. Is it the architecture? Is it the historical significance? Or what is it? And then here where he says, when I see them, I remember my ancestors. Well, that's kind of weird. You can't remember people you've never met before. So I don't know why he's saying this. So maybe he could say, I am reminded of my ancestors, but you can't actually remember them.
Do you like any famous modern buildings in the world?
Yes, I do like several, but my favourite is the Sydney Opera House in Australia. I like it because it is a unique and distinctive landmark. In fact, when people see the building, they immediately think of Australia.
This response to this question, do you like any famous modern buildings in the world, is a bit short, but hey, there's nothing too much wrong with it. I mean, he uses words like unique and distinctive landmark, which is pretty good. He doesn't quite explain why it's so distinctive. I mean, it's distinctive because of the shape, right? And then here he says, in fact, when people see the building, they immediately think of Australia. There's nothing wrong with this, but I'm just suggesting maybe he could have said it's a symbol, or it's like a national symbol. So, in fact, when people see the building, they are immediately reminded of Australia, since it is such a national symbol of the country. Just an idea, but there's nothing much wrong with this, except for maybe the length.
What type of buildings are there in your hometown? Well, there are various types, such as commercial buildings, high-rises, shopping malls, and fancy mansions.
This response here is so short. Well, there are various types, such as commercial buildings, high-rises, shopping malls, and fancy mansions. There's nothing wrong with the vocabulary. I mean, commercial buildings is pretty good. High-rises is really good. The other ones, they're kind of mediocre. But, I mean, really, you need to try to paint a picture of what your town looks like. So where are the commercial buildings? So they're probably like downtown or in the commercial district. And where are the high-rises? So you might find high-rises as you travel out towards the outskirts of the city. Well, I mean, I don't know what your city looks like. So maybe the high-rises are downtown. or maybe they're more like in the outskirts of the town. And the shopping malls might be where there's more foot traffic, like in the suburban areas. And then if you go to like the upmarket areas, you'll find the fancy mansions. But really, you need to expand on your answer.
Are the buildings in your country mostly modern or traditional buildings? Honestly speaking, I think both of them can be seen here, because Shanghai is a metropolis, being divided into several different districts. In developed districts like Xuhui and Huangpu, there are many modern buildings, whereas in other districts, traditional and old buildings are common.
Now, you might notice that the question says country, and she's talking about a city. And it's not a big deal. Well, maybe. It depends on how the examiner feels, I guess. Maybe they will repeat the question if you talk about a city when the question is asking about a country. But anyway, let's see. She starts off by saying, honestly speaking. Now, this is not really an opinion. This is not anything controversial. It's just a fact. So for facts, why do we need to say honestly speaking? That doesn't really make sense. Anyway, some good. She uses the word metropolis, which is good, and she uses districts. Some things I don't quite understand. She talks about how Shanghai is a metropolis being divided into several different districts. Why is it being divided? Is it still continuing right now? Are they chopping up the city in this present age? I think she should have said Shanghai is a metropolis divided into several different districts, because I think the division is completed. I don't think they're chopping up the city. That will make it very difficult for people to live there, right? Anyway, but yeah, the biggest problem is she's talking about the city and not the country.
What do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of modern buildings and traditional buildings? For modern buildings, they are stylish and well equipped, while having little cultural value. For traditional ones, they are somehow historic, but not very fashionable and convenient.
Okay, here we have the advantages and the disadvantages all combined into single sentences. I don't know if I would do that. Anyway, let's see. She says here the modern buildings are stylish and well equipped. Well equipped is a good phrase to use. And they have little cultural value. Just about that, exemplify. Like if you're going to say they're well equipped, in what way? And if they have little cultural value, why is that necessarily a disadvantage? I'm not sure. I mean, if I was asked this question, maybe I would talk about the cost. I mean, houses sell for much, or new houses rather. New houses sell for a lot more, although the question doesn't specifically ask about houses, they say buildings, right? Okay. Anyway, cost is still relevant. Maybe it would be easier to talk about cost than it would be about cultural value. And then for the traditional one, she says they're somehow historic. I'm not sure why she says somehow, because if you say somehow, that means you're not sure whether it's true or not, or you're not sure exactly how something happened. I don't know if I would use this word, but I left it in because that's what she said. Now here, they're not very fashionable or convenient, not and convenient, right? Just be careful what you choose as advantages or disadvantages, because you're going to have to give examples or reasons for that. And if you choose something like cultural value, that might be very difficult to talk about. Price, I think, is a lot easier to talk about.
Please describe a traditional house in your country. My favorite traditional house is a restaurant. It used to be a wealthy man's residence with 3 floors, exquisite wooden furniture, and a huge garden outside.
Now, when I looked at this question, I thought she was going to talk about like a well-known traditional house in her country, or like a typical traditional house in her country, but she chose to talk about a specific place that she visited, I assume, or that she knows about. which is okay too. But if it's your experience, then talk about your experience. So, is this a restaurant that you visited? And when you visited it, what did it look like? And what did you do there? She talks about the exquisite wooden furniture and the huge garden outside. So tell us about the furniture. Like if it's a restaurant, I'm assuming it's gonna have tables or maybe some wooden decorations on the walls. And if it's got a huge garden outside, like did you actually go out onto the deck, if there is a deck, and look at the garden, or what did you do in the garden? Was the table outside in the garden? Tell more about your experience, if this is your experience. Remember, part 1 is about your personal experiences. Well, usually.
What kinds of places are popular in China now?
As a matter of fact, there are quite a lot of apartments, tall buildings, skyscrapers in China today. I think it is for the reason that people find it more convenient to live, work or study in these buildings, and they are very modern and attractive.
Well, first of all, this cannot be a real question. What kinds of places are popular in China now? Because places could be anything. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a building. It could be a forest, it could be a beach, it could be anything. So I don't know if this is a real question. I don't think so. Okay, so let's look at the vocabulary. The skyscrapers is pretty good. He does use some referencing. He talks about these buildings. Right at the end, he says, and they're very modern and attractive. You know, one of the criteria for vocabulary, if you want a high score, is you need to be able to collocate well. I don't often hear people talk about attractive buildings. It's a bit strange. I mean, you could say beautiful, or you could talk about the facade, the outside of the building, like it has a beautiful facade. But attractive and buildings don't go together very often. Now, I don't really want to talk about the guy's vocabulary. I don't really want to talk about the guy's pronunciation. But hopefully you notice that he tends to slur his words when he talks. Even though it does seem like he's a native speaker, he does seem to have that problem.
Comparing old buildings and modern buildings, which do people prefer to live in?
As far as I know, there are modern buildings everywhere in today's society. I think it's due to the fact that young people are fond of modern and fashionable buildings, since they are beautiful and well decorated. And as for the old people, I believe they prefer to live in old buildings, because it is spacey and practical, as there is a yard where they can grow some plants or do some exercises.
Okay, so this is one of those questions for which there isn't really a single answer. I mean, different people like different things. And this person acknowledges that in his response, because he talks about old people and he talks about young people. I mean, you can do that, or you can talk about people who live in rural areas versus people who live in the urban areas in the city, or richer, poorer, anything like that. If you can divide the group of people in your country into smaller groups and then talk about those smaller groups, that's a good way to expand your answer. So you can see this answer is a bit longer. Again, there are some words that I can't quite make out. Like, I don't know what he said there. Here, again, he talked about how young people are fond of modern and fashionable buildings. I'm not entirely sure that buildings can go with the word fashionable. These two words don't collocate very well. But as for the rest, it's fine. He talked about old buildings, which are spacey. Now, when we talk about buildings, we often use the word roomy. But hey, spacey is fine also. And he backs it up with some support. He says people like these spacey buildings because of this and of this. So the structure is good. I'm just not sure about the fashionable, and I wish he would speak a little bit more clearly.
How do people in China feel about old buildings?
Well, it really depends. For most old people in China, I think they have strong feelings about old buildings, as most of them think it's natural and comfortable to live in old buildings. Take the courtyards in Beijing, for example. They enjoy great reputations in our country. As for the young people in China, I guess that modern buildings are popular among them. However, I believe more and more people prefer living in old buildings, although there are a number of modern buildings today.
Okay, yes, the question is about buildings, and you should talk about buildings. But look at the buildings. That doesn't exactly show a wide range of vocabulary, does it? So throw in some other words here. Like, what kind of buildings are you talking about? He gives one example of courtyards here. And I'm sure courtyard is actually a building. I mean, a courtyard is a yard. You might find it next to a building, but that's not really an example of a building. Anyway, let's look at the structure. So again, he divides it, but he's using the same division. He divides people into old and young. I mean, if you do that all the time, it's going to be kind of tiresome, right? So maybe think of some other ways of dividing your group of people. Anyway, he says here, I think, as most of them think, it's natural and comfortable to live in old buildings. I mean, why? Why is it natural for people to want to live in old buildings? Why is it comfortable? So give some reasons for that. And then when he talks about the courtyards, he says they enjoy great reputations, but they enjoy a single reputation. So they enjoy a great reputation in our country. And then this last part here, I don't even know why he said this. What is the relevancy of talking about modern buildings when the question is, how do people feel about old buildings? So everything here is pretty much irrelevant to the question.
Is it important to preserve old buildings?
In my perspective, it's quite significant to preserve old buildings. I think there are many reasons. The first one would be that old buildings stand for national culture, and there are many stories have been linked with them. I mean, they are cultural heritage that we should cherish. And if the old or ancient buildings are well preserved, we can educate the next generation by visiting these old, ancient or historical buildings.
Okay, here's the last question. This is one of those more difficult questions that you often find at the end of a topic. Let's see here. He says, from in my perspective, which should be from. So from my perspective, it's quite significant to preserve old buildings. So he switched up the important. He used significant instead. And this might not seem like such a big deal, but it makes you sound quite natural when you use words like quite or so. Just little words like that. I think there are many reasons. The first one. So if you say the first one, we would expect to hear about the second one. But there's no second one. So why say the first one if there's only one? Okay, so anyway, old buildings stand for natural culture. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, they represent national culture. I don't know what happened here, and there are many stories have been linked. Okay, so something happened with the grammar here. So, and many stories have been linked with them. Maybe there should be two now that I think about it. And many stories have been linked to them. But we don't hear any example of the stories. Now, here, heritage is countable. So, I mean, there are a cultural heritage. And again, here I couldn't quite make out what he was saying. I do like the idea of people educating the next generation by visiting these old buildings. But like maybe give an example. Like, is there an old building that has, for example, been turned into a museum that the public visits? Like a, I don't know, maybe like a natural history museum, or maybe just some other building that is of some cultural significance that the public are allowed to visit and maybe are popular with kids, since you're talking about the next generation. Give an example of such a place.